Welcome to Principles of International Relations. In today's class, I would like to go a little bit away from our previous context of historically looking at the development of the international system over centuries, and I would use this kind of information which we got there to step one step further and introduce international relations theory. So this will kind of continue in several steps. First of all, I will focus on the idea of realism, and being one of the oldest international relations theories, but still quite relevant in today's time. I will explain the key kind of features of it, but I will also go into further understanding of what we actually mean by the international system, what are the specific actors, what is anarchy of states, etc. So different kind of factors which are not only used in realism, but which are really important in understanding international relations theory as large. So I will use this kind of information then to kind of continue understanding the assumptions and the kind of predictions realist theories make about the state of the world and the role of power in the international relations. So this is the first of several classes which we'll use to understand the theoretical concepts of international relations. And then in the later stage in this class, we will continue to look at them, to understand them empirically and evaluate them as well empirically. So I hope you will enjoy this lecture. Please stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you in class as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome back. Let's start with our slides today. And as I said just a second ago, I would like to go primarily over ideas of the usefulness of theories, as well as ideas about how they can apply and what kind of factors are the most important in specific theories. And the one which we want to talk about today is realism. So to give you a brief outline, I have written down several points which I think are important in this lesson. And this is, first of all, thinking about the use of theory. Why do we need it? Do we need it? Maybe it's not necessary. Maybe it's leading us in the wrong direction. So we can discuss this here and also in our class later on. But then, once we kind of talked about this, I would like to go into the first theory of this class, and this is called realism. So I will explain the basic concepts. I will explain the idea of power. Why? Because power is one of the essential parts of this theory. Also want to talk about international system, how realism understands cooperation or the interaction between countries, and what they mean if they talk about an international system. I want to talk about something specifically which has been developed by a realist theory, and that is the idea of anarchy of states. That's a special concept about how countries interact with each other. And it's not only used by realism, but it is kind of prominent there and a really important feature. So I will talk about this. This is in a way can be seen as the flip side of sovereignty, another kind of key part of realist theory. And then at the end of the class, I would like to talk about some aspects of outcomes of realist theory. So how we applied it, or how it was applied, especially in the beginning of the development of this realist theory in the 1950s and 60s. So that was, you have to see that this was the start of the Cold War, and there was a specific use which is often called balance of power. This. At the very end of this class, I want to kind of go over key aspects of NeoRealism. That is some kind of further development of realism. So, okay, let's jump right in. what is international relations theory? Why do we need to bother with it? So in a way, we have talked about events already before. We can talk about world politics, and newspapers and television stations do that all the time, every day. So they rarely used the ideas of international relations theory, and they never kind of discuss it in terms of theoretical concepts. So I wonder why it is important, or maybe if it's important at all. So please make a little break now, think about this, and write down a couple of points which you think are important. We can kind of catch on with this discussion in our in-person class, and use and deepen these ideas there. But for the moment, I would like you to write down some parts and think what you think, without kind of going further through this lecture, what you think is important in these aspects. Okay. Well, I hope this 10 minutes are over now. Welcome back. And I will give you a brief take what I think why we could bother about this. And I think I take first a quote from Morgenthau, which is a relatively old quote from 1985, but I think it brings brings a good point to our discussion about the usefulness of theories. And he says that theories bring order and meaning to the mass of phenomena which without it would remain disconnected. So, and that's something which, if you are interested in politics, what we all experience quite frequently is this idea we kind of get bombarded with lots of things which happen throughout the days, throughout the world. And very often it's difficult actually to make sense of it. What does it mean? Why is it taking place? And not just in a very narrow place, like this kind of country started being aggressive, so the other country is aggressive in return, or something like this. But is there a kind of a more overview perspective, like a bird's eye perspective, where we can see patterns of behavior which are a bit removed from this kind of day-to-day political behavior? And I think that's very important, not because the day-to-day facts don't matter, but rather because this kind of overview brings more meaning to them. So we can actually kind of understand which facts are important and which are maybe not so important, or which are kind of leading us in a way of thinking along the lines of one theory, and the other is towards another theory. So we can kind of use these events which happen, but we need to have this framework in order to kind of make sense of them. And that's also the kind of key points what I wrote down here. Like understanding and interpreting events is not just knowing that they existed, but it's also kind of putting them in some kind of framework. It's also really important for simplification of reality, because there's so many things happening at the same time, and not everything is kind of linear going in the same direction. So there can become aspects of cooperation, aspects of conflict, aspects of economic prosperity, aspects of economic problems, etc., can all be happening at the same time. And what we do need to understand is which ones are the really kind of the crucial facts and which ones are less important. So theory helps us to kind of simplify what happens in the real world, and kind of know what we would think are the key, the important facts which happen. Another thing which is often said, is the idea of prediction. And I made a question mark here. Why? Because, yes, in a way, prediction is something which we are really interested in, because we want to know how our actions affect the future and what will happen in the future. But one of the issues with theories is that they are normally not a blueprint for, they cannot predict linearly what what will happen in the future. So there are many kind of effects which are kind of coincide with each other. So use kind of being overconfident in our theories and say like these theories will predict that and that will happen is not necessarily a good way of using them. But what we can say is that, for example, certain dangers exist if we kind of escalate a conflict, and this kind of leads us to certain dangers because of our understanding of the international system or something like this. So we can use them to kind of make informed guesses about future challenges, but not kind of take them as a blueprint for what will happen in the future. One thing which we should really not do is, and that is coming really out of this idea or limitation of prediction, is we should not use them as guides for action. So we shouldn't say like international relations theory says we should do A, B, and C in order to become be better off in the future. That's, again, these theories are good in finding overall patterns in behavior and overall patterns in situations, but not necessarily making point predictions for individual behavior. And so it's not good to use them as action guides for individual decisions. Okay. Before we actually talk about the kind of key ideas and assumptions of realism, I think we should go one step back and think about the origins. And therefore, we have to see like that that the realist theory came to prominence really after the end of the Second World War. So why at that time? Well, before the Second World War, in the interwar period, and even before the First World War, a lot of academic work has been dominated by something like called idealism. So scholars thought about an utopian, ideal way society should work or could work, and they were kind of finding the best possible scenarios for how humans could live together, how international law would work, morality, and all the different aspects of it. And this work is really interesting, and it's still interesting today. But one of the problems was that that the two world wars have taught us that even if we have nice utopian ideas how cooperation could happen, it's not that all actors are kind of agreeing with this and all are kind of following these ideas for a better world. And so realists really said, like, no, we need to not think about the best possible solutions. We need to think about something else. We need to think about how to avoid the worst situations. And therefore, the concept of realism was really not to kind of assume very high moral values for humans, but rather kind of say, like, if we assume the worst case scenario, what will happen in international politics? And that comes really out because realists blamed idealists for looking too much, being too optimistic about the future, and that World War II has proven that this is not the world we are living in. However, realist is not an idea which just came up after the Second World War and wasn't available beforehand. We really do have many scholars who have worked, and I just name here a couple of maybe famous one: Sun Tzu, Hobbes, and Morgenthau and Waltz, of course, as the early adopters of realism, are all kind of having some very common ideas about the views of power in politics, etc. Having said that, the real kind of the idea to build like a coherent concept of how power structures work and how the international politics works really kind of came up after the Second World War. And that was the real time when first time it was really studied conceptually in this way. And therefore it's really important for us to understand.
And the key factor here is really about this idea of power, political power. Something you should keep in mind is that that realists separate this idea about power struggle, and domination of actors from other ideas which we often kind of connect with political behavior. Something like morality. So is this the right decision? Is this a moral decision, or can it be considered immoral? Also, ideology, like something like communism versus capitalism, or any other aspects of economic life, are not necessarily kind of important for realist analysis of international relations. The key factor realists think about is this idea about power and power distribution in the world, unequal power distribution in the world. So, to say this very simply, states pursue their own interests in international system of sovereign states without a central authority. So these are, we will talk about this just in a minute, but states, like countries, are the entity which is really important, which is really kind of a realist focus on. These, according to the realists, are the most important player. They interact with other countries as sovereign actors. So they are they have the power to act over for the interests of the people within this country. And one really interesting aspect is that there is no higher authority as the states itself. So they are maybe cooperating, or they are maybe having a conflict, but there's no higher entity where they can talk to kind of mediate or say who is right or wrong. So in a way, you could, that's probably a pretty bad comparison, but you could see this like states are like a group of children all together. So they might play nicely together, they might fight over something, but there is nobody like a parent around to supervise them, to say, if in case conflict happens, to say what they should do, or who should apologize, who is right and who is wrong, etc. So this kind of function is non-existent in the international system. So in a way, realism is really you should be seen not necessarily as or probably not as the best theory to describe international politics, but it was really important and very central to it. It was one of the first theories which really said that we have to theorize the overall interaction between countries in a conceptual manner. It also founded these principles of dominance, the idea that power is the central term which defines political behavior. And so in this way, it is really important to understand it. Why? Because it is the basis for all the other theories which come afterwards, and because they are using it as a basis to distinguish themselves, criticize it, and give other suggestions along these lines. So it might not be the most fashionable and newest theory around, but it can be seen as a benchmark where every other theory is positioning themselves to. This is a little graph or table out of our readings, and I think it's a good idea to see where realism and idealism are really distinguished from each other and changed. So in terms of human nature, idealists think actually that humans are altruistic, that they are working for the better good. Realists don't think that. They think that humans are selfish and that they are having their own interests in mind. The most important actors in the international system are, for realists, states. States are the key actors, and there are some others which are maybe having some influence in terms of providing a forum to discuss, etc. But states are the predominant constant. While idealists really thought about states are one among others, including individuals like very charismatic leaders like Churchill or Roosevelt, having a big impact on political decision making as well. Realists don't think so. They think states matter and nothing else. The persons are interchangeable. If they think about the cause of the state behavior, realists think about the rational pursuit of self-interest. What do we mean? That means like a state defines what the best outcome of a situation is for themselves, and then they pursue this outcome based on the cost-benefit calculations of the states involved. Idealists think quite differently. They think about maybe psychological motives of decision making, like being scared, having traumatized experiences in the past, being overconfident, or any other kind of aspects which might lead to certain political decision making. The nature of the international system and what anarchy means, we will talk a little later about, but realists think about an anarchic state. So that means, I give you a brief now, and then we talk about it in more detail later. That means there's no higher level than the state level, and these kind of states are in an anarchic relationship because they cannot be controlled by anybody else. The idea of idealism was very different. It was about a community, so that it's a community of states which coexist with each other and need to get along. So one of the kind of, what you probably have guessed already, is this kind of the central concept of realism is the idea of power. But there's one problem with it. Power is very difficult to measure. Well, we can see like how many military might a country has, or how economically strong it is. But it's really difficult to measure it in detail. So one way lots of scholars measure power is by something like the first sentence here, the ability to get another actor to do what it would not otherwise have done. So if you're powerful, you can get somebody else to do something which they wouldn't have done without you. That sounds plausible, but one of the problems here is this idea of a circular logic. So if people get other people, or if countries get other countries to do what they want, then they must be powerful. This assumption is there, but it's kind of, but we don't know whether it is really the power which is influencing the others to go along, or other factors. So in a way, we are kind of defining power in a way which we use it as an explanatory variable afterwards. And this kind of circular logic is really problematic. So some scholars went along and said, like, okay, we need to find some kind of external ways to define power. So they went on to say something like basic characteristics of states. For example, the size of a state, the GDP, the military capacity as well. This has an advantage because it is not measuring, it is not have the same form of circular logic. But lots of scholars think that this is actually not going far enough, because there are others, like maybe being very reliable, or having very good network, or being very convincing. It could also kind of be sources of power which are not measured in the same way. One aspect which I want to say is the idea about relative power. Relative power is an important concept in a realist theory. And what they say is that it's not so much about the absolute power, that means like how many weapons you have, but how a country is there standing in relation to other countries. So if, in a way, if all countries are very weak and one is a little bit more powerful, then suddenly this is the most powerful country within this set of in the international system. And the relationship, how much more powerful this country is than, towards the others, is much more important than actually the absolute form of power. So if all countries are very powerful, but there is not much difference between them, then they are canceling, their power is canceling each other out. And therefore, we don't need to think so much about the absolute form, but rather the relative comparison between the different states. So let's go to the idea of an international system. So states interact with each other in kind of a set of rules. And this kind of rules are often called the rules of the game. So this interaction between the countries is kind of considered to be the international system, where all the countries are participating. I give you a probably pretty bad analogy for that, but you could think about this a little bit like a pool billiard table. So you have this table and you have these balls around lying around, and you're shooting the white ball in order to kind of pocket the other balls. And in a way, any shoot which is kind of taken by the white ball hits maybe several of the balls, or in our kind of case of international relations, the countries. And with each of them, the whole picture changes on the table. So the relationship from one ball to another is changing, and for every ball in this, even if you just move one ball from every ball, the relationship from every ball to this ball is changing in this system, and that's how we can maybe think about the international system as well. It's not something which is just like bilateral between two countries. A relationship between Japan and China is not only affecting those two countries, but it's also affecting all the neighboring countries. And in fact, according to realist theory, it will affect every single country in the world. It would have an effect on them because there's one change in the system. So these kind of this system, all the countries together are kind of shaping the international system. Okay, let's go to another idea, and that is the idea of anarchy of states. I hinted at it already a couple of times beforehand, but realists believe that the international system exists in a state of anarchy. What do we mean with anarchy here? It's not something, it doesn't have anything to do with chaos per se, but it means that there is no higher hierarchy which can governments or states say what they can do and what they cannot do. So there is no world government at the moment. So this lack of enforcement of rules above the level of the individual states makes them to take certain precautions. So, for example, governments or countries deploy military, so in case they get invaded, they can defend themselves. Or they are kind of taking precautions in relations with countries. So if they get tricked or if these relations kind of sour, that they can kind of get easily out of it and don't need and are not depending on other countries. So in a way, this kind of lack of overreaching like central body of enforcing general rules is becoming problematic for the states, because they need to kind of take care of themselves. In a way, if you compare this to a domestic level, if we we as citizens within one state, we don't necessarily feel the need to protect ourselves. Hardly anybody in Japan, at least, is running around with a gun just in case, to kind of be able to defend themselves just in case they are attacked. Why is that the case? Well, because there's a police system, there is a legal system, which is kind of protecting individuals and individual rights. And if there's a violation of these individual rights, then the police and the judicial system will kind of take over and punish the person who violated the individual rights of this one person, the victim. And so, in a way, on a domestic level, we do have this overarching institution, the state, which regulates the individual behavior of all its citizens. But we don't have this on the international level. So there's no overreaching world government like this. So we could ask whether this would be a solution. And throughout the class, we will kind of think a little bit more about maybe whether organizations like the United Nations, etc., could take over some of the roles of a mediator within conflict. But how we can see it for the moment is that at the moment this organization doesn't exist, and therefore we are living in a state of anarchy, according to a realist theory. However, we should kind of think that just because we're talking about anarchy, that it's chaotic. So realists think that actually that generally interaction can be peaceful, and there's no necessity for conflict, and that even norms are built out how this interaction is taking place. But at the same time, if there's conflict resistant, then there is no higher body to rely on. Another really important concept which realists use is the idea of sovereignty. So that means that a government has the right to over a certain territory, and then kind of proceed in the interests of the citizens within this territory. In a way, this sovereignty is seen as is generally accepted as a concept which all kind of countries abide to. However, there are limitations for this. So sometimes the first problem is that there's a lack of a world police to punish states if they break this idea of sovereignty. So we do have times where one country is occupying another country. For example, how Germany occupied different countries in the Second World War, or how Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula in more recent times. In a way, there is no external body who can stop this and kind of see whether it was rightful or wrong, and kind of punish in case there has been some misbehavior taking place. So in this way, this kind of individual countries cannot necessarily be certain that the norm of sovereignty is really taking place. At the other hand, there's also some other issues. For example, that certain countries really don't want certain behavior to happen. For example, you can see the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, where nuclear powers generally want that countries do not try to acquire nuclear weapons. And if we kind of look at the North Korean conflict in recent years, we can see that one of the key issues there is the idea that North Korea wants to claim nuclear weapons, and many countries around it, and the Western countries especially, don't want that North Korea is acquiring nuclear weapons because they think it is a security risk for themselves. So in a way, sovereignty is accepted generally, but not necessarily seen as absolute. So in fact, actually, what we see that it becomes harder and harder for countries to ward off interference in their domestic affairs. Something which of course also goes in the line like with the ideas of saying human rights and other kind of international norms of how to behave. Many countries in the world think that there should be a certain standard for behavior of different countries in respect to their own citizens, and therefore criticize behavior. So we we could think about the Uyghur camps in China in the perspective of sovereignty. This is of course a domestic issue, but in the perspective of human rights and international law, this can be seen as a violation of the individual human rights of the Uyghur minority, and some would even kind of compare this to a situation of a possible genocide, which then might justify overcoming this rule of sovereignty. So sovereignty is seen as a really important concept, but in reality it's not always accepted as absolute. And we will discuss within this class even further these kind of ideas. So the last point I want to make here is this idea of balance of power. So lots of research in realist theory, which uses realist theory, is kind of thinking about this idea about counterbalancing. So what, from a global perspective, what is the most stable international system? Is it somewhere there is one hegemon, as we had with the British Empire? Is it one where do you have like two superpowers, like we had during the Cold War? Or is it a multipolar world where we have many kind of regional powers? They also think very much what are the ideas about alliances. Are alliances really important in understanding the stability of the international system? So there is something which is called bandwagoning versus balancing, which we will talk at a later stage about, but this is under the ideas of alliances, where bandwagoning is basically countries follow the strongest actor and try to be friends with the strongest power, like in a hegemonic world. And balancing is where other countries are trying to balance out maybe two different strong actors. So if one becomes much stronger, then by alliances, the other actor can balance this kind of shift in power out. Way. So one idea which is often used along these lines is this idea of great powers. And I want to use this slide to quickly say like what is often seen as meant when we talk about great powers, because in lots of the literature we will kind of see this, these words. So in the last centuries until the 20th century, this was predominantly European powers. There is a kind of a technical definition, and it's often said like it can only be defeated militarily by another great power. But generally, this is often seen nowadays as some of the strongest economic powers and the strongest military powers. So we could kind of think of countries like the US, China, Russia, Japan, France, and Britain. In this way, at the current world, of course, we could see maybe India should also be in this list. In the current world, we could of course see the US as the sole superpower, and China becoming maybe the biggest competitor with a large population and a growing military capabilities and nuclear arsenal as well. So if you think about this in terms of military expenditure and GDP. Very often what we see from realists is that they say like, well, economic power matters because it kind of creates military expenditure, and therefore they are very similar in their in their outlook. And what we see here, if we kind of take a comparison between the two, we can see that some countries which are the most economically successful, like US and China, are also kind of having large military budgets. But others like Japan and Germany, which have rather large GDPs, spend much less on their military. Again, France, Britain spend more. Russia has a much smaller economy and spends more in its military capacity. So we don't see that there's an ideal mirror between the two kind of things of GDP and military expenditure. I want to take the last couple of minutes. I would like to take a look at something which is called the NeoRealism, and that is some liberal ideas which we will talk about next class have become prominent after the start of the early of the work of the early realist scholars like Morgenthau and others, and so these liberalist views really kind of highlighted certain problems in the realist perspective. And Kenneth Waltz then, in a later work in 1979, The Theory of International Politics, he addressed these kind of issues and tried to kind of solve them within the framework of the classical realism. So the one thing is really what he really kind of introduced, what is the key idea of his work, is that the national politics works a little bit like a market, like an economic market. So in a way, human nature is not necessarily to be competitive or trying to dominate each other, but within this international system, and due to the anarchy of the international system, countries don't have a chance to act differently. So it's like a market where only the countries which are the most competitive are capable of survival, and the others are not. And therefore it is in the interest of every country to become as powerful as possible, not necessarily because they want to dominate other countries, but rather because they want to kind of secure their own survival. Other key aspects of neorealism are this idea of the systemic anarchy, so that really kind of the system drives this kind of form of anarchy. This is not a state which is necessarily always true, but it's kind of systemic, based on this individual system. And that we actually really have to think about it as I said before, as this kind of pool table relationship from every country towards every other country. So this power relationship is kind of fixed, and that sometimes if a country becomes more powerful or less powerful, like decline of the Soviet Union or the end of the Soviet Union and the decline of Russia afterwards, or the rise of China, to give some examples, are then leading to a change of this system. And as Wald thinks, is that these kind of changes are times where the international system is quite volatile, and it can be dangerous because it challenges position, because of the relative power, it challenges positions of different actors. However, in terms of taking over some of the aspects of classical realism, Kenneth Waltz also thinks that states are rational and unitary actors, so they act as one kind of national interest, and they act rational, not in terms of act of fear or psychological issues. And he also focuses on this idea that national interests is existent, and that there's an absence of morality in this, so that we shouldn't make a distinction between countries which are doing well, good things for humanity, and countries which are not doing good things. But he says essentially it is a power struggle between the countries, and countries act equivalent in this kind of power struggle. This is something which goes back on the power distribution in the international system, was something which Kenneth Waltz was very interested in. We see here like the ideas which I highlighted already before. What kind of shapes can the international system have? Can it something like a multipolar system where you have more centers of power, maybe regional powers, and smaller countries around it? Something like a tripolar system, which is that there are 3 powers, and the rest of the countries are less strong. A bipolar system where you have 2 countries, and that's basically the situation which we had during the Cold War. 2 superpowers competing, or a unipolar system where you have one hegemon who is much more powerful than all the other actors. And we can compare this a little bit to the situation of the British Empire, or maybe even towards the United States after the end of the Cold War. The power transition theory I highlighted already a little bit. So Kenneth Waltz thinks that it's really the challenge is not that the international system is anarchic. So if the power relation between the countries stays similar, there is no reason for it having any conflict. But once in a while, if there's something like a power transition, if one actor becomes much more powerful, or one actor is declining in its power, this kind of there's a disruption of the relative power between the countries. And this can lead to challenges and even wars. And Waltz kind of focuses here on the idea of Germany and becoming more powerful before the First World War, and also before the Second World War, and therefore becoming a challenger and trying to compete with countries like France and Great Britain, and starting wars because of this. So this is more like a graphical kind of interpretation of what he calls the multipolar system, the bipolar system, or the unipolar or hegemonic system, and the stability of them. Relatively speaking, according to most realist theories, you would say that a bipolar system is quite stable. Unipolar system can also be stable, but it's really depending on the strength of this unipolar, like the hegemon. If the hegemon becomes weaker, then suddenly it kind of transforms into multipolar system, and which is generally seen as less stable. Why? Because actually we have many different conflict lines and possible conflict lines, and therefore multipolar system has more possibilities of conflict overall. I think we should kind of discuss this also further in our class, maybe. Well, let me at the very end kind of say like some of maybe the consequences if we think about the international system in realist perspective. And that's something which has also become very critical. And that is that interest-driven politics is the key. So foreign policy is kind of removed from this idea of morality, of kind of finding a better global society. It's only driven by interest. And foreign policy becomes a game where countries compete with each other because relative power is so important. So they are actually just kind of trying to challenge each other in order to become more powerful actors. So therefore, morality is not really a component at all. And especially if kind of politicians cite things like realist ideas, that can be very problematic in reality. The other thing is that change can only occur through what I wrote here, war, but not necessarily war, but change of the power structure. It can also be by the collapse of a political system like we had with the Soviet Union. But there is some conflictual component to any kind of change in the international system. So this is true to what we have here, the power transition theory. So we really have to kind of keep it in mind that from a realist perspective, conflict has to occur, and in order to have any kind of redistribution. And that's often seen as a major criticism. So we can see two levels of criticism. One is a theory-based criticism. Sorry about that. The first one on the theory-based criticism is anarchy is not a condition which always has to exist. So realists think like, okay, the world is kind of made up by states, and they are in the system of anarchy, and that's more or less like given for all times. But we do know that there's no necessity for this. So there could be a world government. There could also be some kind of other monitoring systems which kind of change the conditions of anarchy of the states. And so criticism has come about on this level that maybe realism is too pessimistic about what kind of changes international system can take. Another thing which is always very often criticized is this focus on states alone. And if we kind of look at the world nowadays, we do see that companies can be multinational companies with huge budgets could have a big influence on international politics. Also, non-governmental organizations can have an impact on international politics. Governmental international organizations like the United Nations have a big impact on international politics. So a lot of critics say that this kind of state-centric perspective is too narrow. The other thing is that the last point, which is very frequently mentioned, is that the notion of sovereignty is quite questionable. So they have this very rigid structure where there's like within a country, preferences within a country distill to one national interest, which is then pursued by the state actor. If we look more closely at this, we can see that there is considerable variation within the opinions within the country or a state. And for example, within the change of leadership can make big changes in international politics. As you could see from the Obama administration towards the Trump administration in the United States, which led to a completely different approach in international politics. So a lot of criticism about realist theory is that it doesn't look at this sub-national level and says basically states are the only component we need to look at, and power is the only factor which is relevant. I want to highlight some kind of political-based criticism about the theory, which is not entirely fair to say that this is something which is inherently problematic for the theory itself, but it's rather something of a misunderstanding how people use this kind of realist theory. And that is that if we are kind of thinking about the world as not acting morally, always in competition in order to kind of get more power, it legitimizes inequality and it legitimizes conflict, because we say this is the nature of the international system, so we have to kind of respond in this. That's also one of the reasons why I think politicians should not use theories or spaces of their political actions, but rather we should use it just to interpret certain scenarios. So if people, if governments think that they're living in an international world which is based on the principles of realism, then they would maybe leave out lots of forms of cooperation which realism is not considering, but might be possible in reality, and might see the world in a much more conflictual way than it actually is. So to quickly summarize on these ideas on realism, we can highlight that realism explains international relations in terms of power. So power is the most important aspect. In a way, where does this power come from? Well, it comes from mostly military power, but economic capabilities is a good proxy for kind of building up resources. However, as I said before, economic power doesn't necessarily always need to lead to military power, and vice versa. International anarchy means that the state is a sovereign, self-interested actor, and that there is no higher actor above them which can control these states. And that's really important to understand a lot of the concepts of realists have about cooperation and conflict in the international system. Power transition theory says wars often occur when we have a shift of power. So if a country becomes more powerful over time, or if a country becomes less powerful. And so these kind of forms of transition make an instability in the international system and therefore more prone to have conflict. In terms of stability, we can know that hegemony can provide, at least temporarily, as long as the hegemon is strong enough, stability. And we can also see that bipolar systems can be relatively stable. However, we should always see, especially in bipolar systems, that there's a great risk that a major escalation of conflict can occur. That one thing is the last thing which we have to keep in mind, that the realist and rational actor approaches take states as unitary actors, which maximize their utility. So we have a state as something called national interest, and each state tries to optimize on this kind of national interest, despite morality and other aspects. So this is the kind of the basic concepts which we have in international in realist theory. And if some of the things are confusing, we will of course talk during our class more about these concepts. I hope I can entice you to think conceptually about political decision making in this way. And over time, we will kind of repeat these ideas and these concepts. And I look forward to kind of discuss them with you even more in class. Until then, I hope you have a great day and take care. Bye-bye.
That hummingbird never sang.